March 14th, 2026, 2:47 a.m. 3 fire columns rose simultaneously above the Volga steppe, each visible from 40 kilometers away. Within the hour, satellite imagery confirmed what analysts in Kyiv already knew. Ukraine had just hit targets 340 kilometers inside Russia, and the fires were still burning. I'm your host at SteelHorizon, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight isn't about a single drone or a single strike. It's about 6 weeks of silence before 6 seconds of fire. About how Ukraine's security service, the SBU, methodically dismantled the assumption that Russia's deep interior was beyond reach. 3 petroleum refineries, 3 oblasts, 22 minutes between the first and last explosion, and a fuel crisis that forced Russian armored formations near Zaporizhzhia to pull back from planned assault positions within 72 hours. This isn't the story of the explosion. It's the story of how it was set up. The intelligence networks, the drone relay prepositioning, the shift change timing, and the human risk baked into every step. Russia's GRU believed these facilities were untouchable. They were wrong. Tonight, we explain exactly how Ukraine proved it. Real tactics, real consequences. SteelHorizon. To understand why this operation mattered, you need to understand what Russia was burning through. By late 2025, Russian ground forces along the southern axis, from Zaporizhzhia down through Kherson and Melitopol, were consuming petroleum products at a rate that strained even Russia's domestic infrastructure. T-72BM tanks running continuous rotations, TOS, 1A thermobaric systems repositioning between fire missions, armored personnel carriers shuttling infantry across contested ground. Every vehicle, every generator, every helicopter fuel stop, all of it connected to a logistics chain running north through Rostov and northeast through Saratov and Volgograd oblasts. The 3 facilities targeted on the night of March 14th weren't randomly selected. The SBU's Deep Strike Planning Cell, working alongside Ukrainian military intelligence, the HER, spent 11 weeks building targeting packages on Russian fuel infrastructure. They cross-referenced commercial satellite imagery, open-source fuel price monitoring in Russian regional markets, and intercepted logistics communications. 3 facilities rose to the top. A petroleum distribution hub outside Pugachev in Saratov Oblast, a refinery complex south of Volgograd near the Oksai River, and a fuel storage and processing node in Engels, the same city that hosts Russian strategic bomber operations. The nearest of the 3 sat 340 kilometers from the closest known Ukrainian drone launch zone. Russia considered this safe. Comfortably, arrogantly safe. Which weapon, in your assessment, was most decisive in enabling this operation's reach? A. Long-range FPV drones operating through relay networks. B. Ground-based SBU assets with pre-positioned incendiary payloads. C. A combination of both working in sequence. Drop your answer in the comments. We'll return to this at the end. Planning began in earnest in late January 2026. Ukrainian intelligence had a problem that had nothing to do with weapons or platforms. It was a human problem. Getting verified intelligence on exact security shift schedules, on the precise location of fuel storage tanks versus administrative buildings, on the timing of internal CCTV rotation and perimeter guard patterns. That required people, not satellites, not signals intelligence. People on the ground, or within communicating distance of people on the ground, who could feed verified details back to Kyiv without triggering FSB counterintelligence. 3 months before the strike, an SBU handler working a source network in the Volga region lost contact with a primary asset near Pugachev. For 11 days, the entire operation froze. The asset had gone dark without the agreed emergency protocol signal, meaning the blackout wasn't a capture, but it wasn't intentional either. It was the kind of silence that leaves a room of intelligence officers staring at a map and calculating acceptable risk. When the asset resurfaced, a medical emergency, nothing operational. The window for the original March timeline had already partially collapsed. The SBU had to compress a 2-week final reconnaissance phase into 9 days. That compression almost broke the operation. Almost. Going through the reconstructed operational timeline that Ukrainian sources allowed to surface after the fact, one detail kept standing out. The shift change window the planners eventually exploited wasn't the originally intended entry point. It was the backup, the primary window. A 40-minute gap during a fuel inventory audit cycle was abandoned when one of the relay drone positioning teams encountered a Russian FSB checkpoint near a rural road in Saratov Oblast that wasn't on any known patrol schedule. The team aborted. The relay node for Sector 1 had to be repositioned to a secondary site 3 kilometers further from the target, reducing signal reliability by a margin the technical team in Kyiv flagged as borderline acceptable. They accepted it anyway. The operation was already in motion. Drone relay infrastructure was the operational spine of the entire strike. Ukrainian FPV drones have an effective combat radius of roughly 5 to 8 kilometers in open terrain without relay assistance. For a target 340 kilometers inside Russia, that range problem requires a fundamentally different architecture. What the SBU and her teams built across the 6-week preparation window was a distributed relay network, a series of signal-boosting nodes pre-positioned across the intervening terrain to extend drone control range in cascading segments. Each node was small, camouflaged, battery-powered, and designed to be expendable. Some sat in tree lines, some in agricultural outbuildings. The teams that placed them worked at night, moving in vehicles that wouldn't draw attention in Russian rural areas. This wasn't drone warfare. It was signals infrastructure construction inside an adversary's territory, conducted in silence, with zero margin for error. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next section is where the operation either worked or collapsed entirely, and it very nearly collapsed. The shift change at the Pugachev distribution hub occurred at 2:30 a.m. local time on the night of March 14th. Outgoing security personnel left the main gate at approximately 2:28 a.m. Incoming personnel signed in and reached their posts by 2:34 a.m. The gap between full post coverage was roughly 6 minutes. Ukrainian planners had verified this pattern across 14 consecutive nights of observation using human reporting and a small commercial-grade optical sensor pre-positioned on a hilltop 4 kilometers from the facility perimeter. 6 minutes isn't a lot, but it was enough. The strike sequence ran in 3 simultaneous threads, each targeting one facility, each with its own drone control team operating from positions inside Ukraine through the relay network. Thread 1 targeted Pugachev. Thread 2, the Oksai River complex outside Volgograd. Thread 3, Engels. At 2:41 a.m., Thread 1 initiated. The first FPV drone crossed the final relay node and entered terminal guidance range. It carried an incendiary payload, not explosive in the conventional military sense, but designed to initiate sustained combustion on contact with petroleum storage infrastructure. The drone struck a secondary pump station at the Pugachev hub at 2:47 a.m. Fuel vapor ignition was immediate. The fire column was visible within 90 seconds. Thread 2 initiated at 2:43 a.m. The Oksai River complex presented a different targeting challenge. Its primary storage tanks were partially buried, with earthen berms on 3 sides. The relay signal path for Thread 2 had been the most technically difficult of the 3, running through terrain with higher electromagnetic interference from nearby Russian military communication arrays. The team had tested the relay chain 8 times in the preceding week using non-armed test signals. On the night of the strike, the chain performed within acceptable parameters. The drone reached terminal guidance range at 2:49 a.m. and struck the above-ground pumping infrastructure. Secondary ignition from vapor spread reached the storage area within 4 minutes. The Oksai fire column rose at 2:53 a.m. How many distinct petroleum infrastructure nodes did Ukraine's SBU coordinated operations strike in this single night? A-2 facilities across 1 oblast. B-3 facilities across 2 oblasts. C-4 facilities with 2 confirmed destroyed. Hold that question. The answer matters more than you might think, and we'll explain exactly why at the end. Thread 3. Engels. Engels isn't simply a fuel depot city. Engels 2 Air Base sits adjacent to the urban area, hosting Russian Tu-95MS and Tu-160 strategic bombers, the same aircraft that have launched cruise missile salvos against Ukrainian cities since 2022. Ukrainian intelligence flagged the fuel storage node at Engels for targeting not only because of its logistics value to Southern Axis ground forces, but because any disruption to the Engels fuel ecosystem created secondary pressure on bomber sortie planning. Hitting fuel infrastructure that simultaneously served ground logistics and strategic aviation wasn't accidental. It was designed. Thread 3 initiated at 2:44 a.m. The relay path to Engels was the longest and most complex of the 3 chains. It ran through 3 relay nodes instead of 2, with the final node positioned within an estimated 12 kilometers of the target. The drone carrying the incendiary payload navigated the final leg in near-complete autonomy. The signal latency at that range through 3 relay hops was high enough that real-time human piloting became unreliable. The operators had pre-programmed the terminal guidance phase using a waypoint system. The drone reached the Engels fuel storage node at 3:01 a.m. and struck the above-ground infrastructure on the eastern side of the complex. Ignition was immediate. 22 minutes after the first strike at Pugachev, 3 fire columns were burning simultaneously. The last appeared at 3:09 a.m. when the Engels blaze fully took hold of the secondary storage area. Here's what this tells us about the architecture of modern covert strikes. The 22-minute window wasn't a failure of coordination. It was intentional. SBU planners had calculated that a near-simultaneous pattern, close enough in time to be clearly deliberate, spread enough to prevent Russian emergency responders from repositioning between sites, would create maximum confusion in the Russian emergency response system. And it did. Russian regional emergency services in Saratov and Volgograd oblasts were activating simultaneously, pulling resources in multiple directions. The FSB's initial assessment, based on intercepted communications analyzed by Ukrainian signals intelligence, was that the strikes were 3 separate incidents, not a coordinated operation. That misread cost them critical early response time. What's most surprising about this operation isn't the reach, though 340 kilometers is extraordinary. It's that Russia's GRU had no pre-strike tactical warning. Not because Ukrainian operational security was perfect. It wasn't. There were moments. The lost asset, the aborted relay node placement, the borderline signal reliability on the Volgograd thread, where the operation's seams were visible. The GRU failed to detect them, not because it was blind, but because it was looking in the wrong direction. Russian counterintelligence assessed the primary Ukrainian deep strike threat vector as aerial, drones launched from Ukrainian territory in conventional strike profiles. The SBU's relay network approach didn't fit that model. It required a fundamentally different detection methodology that Russian services hadn't fully developed for this scale of distributed infrastructure. Here's the take that will probably generate pushback. Russia's decision to concentrate bomber and logistics fuel infrastructure in the Engels area, a city Ukrainian intelligence had publicly identified as a target category since 2023, was a strategic miscalculation driven by institutional arrogance, not resource constraint. Russia had the dispersal options. They chose not to use them because they genuinely believed 340 kilometers was a hard ceiling on Ukrainian reach. That belief wasn't intelligence-driven. It was political. And that gap between political assumption and operational reality is exactly what the SBU exploited. Subscribe to SteelHorizon if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the version that state media tells, but the version that unfolds at 2:47 a.m. over a burning steppe. The aftermath developed in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1. Immediate operational impact, measured in hours. Russian fuel logistics units in Rostov Oblast began registering supply shortfalls within 6 hours of the strikes. The Pugachev hub served as a primary distribution node for fuel convoys running south along the M6 highway corridor. With that node burning, the convoys that would have loaded and departed between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. on March 14th had nothing to move. Russian armored units near Zaporizhzhia, positioned for a planned assault beginning March 16th, started reporting fuel shortfalls to their logistics commands within 48 hours. Ukrainian signals intelligence intercepted at least 7 separate communications in a 36-hour window referencing fuel supply disruptions affecting operational readiness. Phase 2. The Russian military's tactical adjustment measured in days. Armored formations near Zaporizhzhia pulled back from their forward staging positions by March 17th. The withdrawal was roughly 4 to 7 kilometers. Not a collapse, not a rout, but a logistics-driven repositioning that Ukrainian military intelligence tracked in near real time through drone reconnaissance and commercial satellite imagery. The imagery analysis, shared by Western analytical organizations tracking the conflict, confirmed vehicle movement patterns consistent with fuel conservation protocols. Russian formations don't drive tanks without purpose when fuel is rationed. The vehicles stopped moving. The assault timeline slipped. Phase 3. The strategic signal, measured in weeks. The 3 refinery night, as Ukrainian defense analysts began calling it, wasn't merely an operational success. It was a demonstration of capability that changed Russia's threat assessment calculus. Within 2 weeks of the strike, Russian authorities were implementing additional security measures at fuel infrastructure sites across Saratov, Volgograd, and Rostov oblasts. More personnel, physical barriers, increased FSB presence. Every resource diverted to rear area security was a resource not available for frontline operations. One detail stood out when working through the Russian logistical response. The fuel rationing that followed the strikes created a secondary effect that Russian planners clearly hadn't modeled. When armored formations near Zaporizhzhia went into fuel conservation mode, they also reduced vehicle movement that would normally have maintained mechanical readiness. Engines need to run, systems need to cycle. Armor sitting cold for extended periods develops readiness problems. The SBU's strike didn't just delay an assault. It degraded the mechanical readiness of the formations supposed to execute it. If you believe tactics win wars, and after watching what unfolded on the night of March 14th, it's hard to argue otherwise. Type SteelHorizon in the comments. This channel exists to document exactly this, the tactical and operational decisions that determine outcomes. The broader context matters. Ukraine's deep strike campaign didn't emerge fully formed. It evolved across more than 2 years of operational learning, accelerating as Ukrainian forces developed relay drone infrastructure and the SBU's network of assets inside Russian territory expanded and matured. The 3 refinery night was a qualitative threshold, not because the individual techniques were unprecedented, but because the level of simultaneous coordination across 3 separate target packages, 3 separate relay networks, and 3 separate control teams in synchronized timing demonstrated an operational planning maturity that Western analysts hadn't previously seen from Ukrainian covert strike operations at this range. The Western intelligence community's response to the commercial satellite imagery showing 3 simultaneous fire columns was, by multiple accounts, genuine surprise. Not because Ukraine had demonstrated capability to strike inside Russia, that had been established, but because the coordination signature indicated a level of operational synchronization that suggested significant prior rehearsal and a planning architecture more sophisticated than previously assessed. That reassessment had direct consequences for how Western partners engaged with Ukrainian requests for certain categories of technical assistance in the months that followed. On the question of international involvement in enabling this capability, Ukraine's relay drone infrastructure draws on components that are predominantly domestically manufactured or sourced through commercial channels. The FPV drone platforms combine Ukrainian-produced frames and propulsion with commercially available flight controllers and optical systems. The incendiary payloads are domestically developed. What Western partners contributed wasn't hardware in this specific case. It was analytical and intelligence support that helped the SBU refine its targeting packages and validate the commercial satellite imagery interpretation that confirmed target layouts and security patterns. The HIMARS systems the United States provided. M142 launchers firing M31 GMLRS rockets with a range of 70 kilometers, or extended range variants reaching 300 kilometers, weren't the weapon of choice for this operation. The targets were too deep. The operational security requirements too strict for a conventional missile launch that would generate a trackable signature. This was a covert operation, not a conventional strike. The distinction matters. Ukraine increasingly operates in the space between conventional military action and covert intelligence operation, a hybrid that Russia's security services have struggled to counter effectively. What would NATO member states have done differently executing this operation? The doctrinal answer, and it genuinely invites debate, is that most NATO Special Operations Forces would have relied more heavily on precision munitions delivered by air platform, using stealth or standoff range rather than relay drone networks. The relay network approach is distinctly Ukrainian, born from necessity, from the specific constraints of operating in a contested electromagnetic environment without access to stealth air delivery. The ingenuity isn't just tactical, it's industrial. Ukraine built its deep strike capability from the components it had access to, not the components it wished it had. Comment your analysis. What would the NATO approach have looked like, and would it have been more or less effective? The fire at Engels burned for 11 hours. Russian emergency services contained the Pugachev blaze by late afternoon on March 14th, but the storage infrastructure was assessed by OSINT analysts as non-operational for a minimum of 3 to 6 weeks based on the visible damage in satellite imagery. The Oksy River complex fire burned into the following day. Russian state media initially attributed the fires to technical failures, industrial accidents. Within 48 hours, that narrative shifted to acknowledging acts of sabotage by Ukrainian terrorist elements, the standard Kremlin framing for successful Ukrainian deep strikes. The shift in narrative was itself data. Russia's information machinery had abandoned the accident story faster than usual, suggesting the physical evidence on the ground was too obvious to maintain the cover. Russian fuel logistics reporting from regional sources in the weeks following the strikes indicated that replacement supply chains from alternative nodes took between 10 and 18 days to fully compensate for the lost throughput. That window corresponded almost exactly with the period during which Ukrainian forces observed reduced Russian armored activity near Zaporizhzhia. Correlation isn't causation. But in this case, the signals intelligence intercepts, the vehicle movement analysis, and the fuel rationing reports all pointed in the same direction simultaneously. Think about what it actually takes to coordinate 3 covert strike operations simultaneously, in real time, across a relay network spanning hundreds of kilometers, with no margin for communication failure. Put yourself in the position of the Ukrainian control team sitting in a secure facility somewhere in Ukraine at 2:43 a.m., watching 3 separate video feeds from 3 separate FPV drones, each navigating toward a different target, each dependent on a relay chain physically placed by teams operating in hostile territory. 1 dropped signal, 1 relay node failure, 1 wrong turn in the terminal guidance phase. Any single failure point could have turned a 3-fire night into a single explosion and 2 aborted missions. The pressure in that room wasn't abstract. It was the weight of 6 weeks of preparation, of agents who had risked their lives to provide the intelligence, of a relay infrastructure built piece by piece across hostile territory. They held. All 3 chains held. All 3 drones reached their targets. All 3 fires started within 22 minutes of each other. The night of March 14, 2026, carried lessons that both sides immediately began studying. For Ukraine, the validation was operational. Relay network, deep strike architecture works at 340 kilometers, and simultaneous multi-target coordination is achievable with sufficient planning and rehearsal time. The limiting factor isn't technology. It's the intelligence preparation time required to build accurate targeting packages and verify security patterns, and the human network required to gather that information. Expanding this capability means expanding the intelligence networks that feed it. That's a slower process than building more drones. For Russia, the lessons were painful and structurally difficult to address. Dispersing fuel infrastructure. Moving it away from large consolidated nodes toward smaller, distributed storage is expensive, time-consuming, and operationally inconvenient. Hardening existing facilities against this threat category requires perimeter defense systems, electronic warfare coverage, and security personnel at sites previously considered so far from the front line that minimal security was adequate. None of these adaptations are fast. None are cheap. And in the interim, every consolidated fuel node within roughly 400 kilometers of Ukrainian drone relay range is a potential target. Here's something we cut from the final analysis that deserves its own episode. The Engels fuel node strike had a secondary effect on Russian strategic bomber sortie scheduling that hasn't been publicly quantified. Comment more if you want us to dig into what the SBU's deep strike may have cost Russia's air campaign in terms of cruise missile launch capacity. Because the numbers, based on what's available in open sources, are significant. The tactical lesson of the 3 refinery night is precise and transferable. Covert strike operations against rear area logistics infrastructure can achieve operational effects. Delayed assaults, degraded mechanical readiness, forced resource reallocation. That rival or exceed the impact of conventional artillery engagements at the front line. Ukraine demonstrated this not with overwhelming force, but with intelligence, patience, and the willingness to accept the human risk embedded in building networks inside adversary territory. That is the SteelHorizon calculus, not who has more, but who prepares better. Now, the answers you've been waiting for. The quiz from earlier. How many distinct petroleum infrastructure nodes did Ukraine's SBU coordinated operations strike on the night of March 14th? The answer is B3 facilities across 2 oblasts, specifically Saratov and Volgograd. This matters beyond the raw number because 3 simultaneous strikes represent a fundamentally different operational threshold than 2. 2 simultaneous strikes could be attributed to coincidence or a limited capability operation. 3 simultaneous strikes, in a coordinated pattern with a 22-minute spread, constitute a deliberate demonstration of multi-target coordination capability. Russia's GRU was forced to assess not just the physical damage, but the architectural implication. If Ukraine can coordinate 3 simultaneously, what is the ceiling? That question is what drove the subsequent security upgrades across Russian rear-area fuel infrastructure. The opening question: which weapon was most decisive? The answer is C. Relay network FPV drones and ground-based SBU human intelligence assets working in sequence. Neither element works without the other. The drone relay infrastructure delivers the weapon. The human intelligence network delivers the targeting accuracy and timing that makes the strike effective. It isn't a drone program with some intelligence support. It's an intelligence operation that uses drones as its delivery mechanism. 3 questions this operation leaves open for genuine debate. First was targeting angles, with its proximity to strategic bomber infrastructure. A calculated escalation or a logical extension of legitimate fuel logistics targeting? The legal and strategic arguments cut in different directions, and reasonable analysts disagree. Second, could Russia have detected and disrupted this operation if its counterintelligence services were operating at maximum effectiveness? Almost certainly yes. There were seams in the operational planning that a fully alert FSB would have had chances to exploit. The question is why those seams weren't detected. Third, what would you have done differently in the final relay node positioning for the Volgograd thread, knowing that signal reliability was borderline? The technical decision to proceed, despite that risk, was made by people operating under pressure, with incomplete information, in real time. Would you have aborted or accepted the risk? Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. This is SteelHorizon. Subscribe to SteelHorizon, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Volga steppe is quiet now over those 3 sites. The fires are out. The investigation reports are filed in Moscow offices where someone is trying to explain how 3 facilities that were supposed to be beyond reach burned simultaneously in the space of 22 minutes. The wrecks of the fuel infrastructure remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes assumptions without mercy. Stay vigilant.